All right, folks. Good evening. It's Steve Grumbine with Real Progressives again. We are going to have a very interesting show tonight. You know, for as long as I've been doing Real Progressives and as long as I have talked about modern monetary theory, I have had people come out of the woodworks calling me a libertarian. And the ironic thing is that I once was a libertarian. And there's still things about my person that I respect from the libertarian world. There are worldviews that I bring with me that personal freedom, my desire to see marijuana completely legalized. I mean, there's so many things about my belief system that come from a stay out of my business, the anti-NSA, the anti-spying, you name it. There's a lot of things about me that still harken back to that. However, economics was the thing that broke me from being a libertarian, literally, because I started understanding state theory of money. I started learning chartalism. I started learning the rudiments of MMT after years and years of conservative economic training, neoclassical training, learning all the old Milton Friedmanisms, and even going so far as to learning Austrian economics, praxeology, things like that took me into the Ron Paul camp. So it was with great surprise that I found I wouldn't call us exactly kindred spirits but we're friends, but we have a very, very similar understanding of the world of economics. And this, my friend, is Ni Ma, and I'm going to bring Ni Ma on now. So welcome to the show, Ni Ma.
Hi, Steve. Happy to be here.
I'm so happy to finally have brought you on. I mean, this is exciting because, most libertarians start from a perspective of taxes force, that, we don't want the government involved in anything, et cetera. And then all of a sudden you take a look at the way the monetary system is truly set up, not the way they'd like it set up, but the way it actually is set up. And you realize this has gone on for a long, long time, long before we ever grasped what MMT was. It was because MMT isn't political in any way, shape, or form. A libertarian can understand MMT. A Republican can understand MMT. A Democrat and a Green and an independent, a progressive, whoever you are, human beings can understand MMT. So tell me about yourself, and then tell me how you came to know MMT.
Yeah, so I come from an Austrian economics background. I was, a big Ron Paul fan, and was and still am much into gold investing and stuff like that. So for a long time, I used to think gold was always money for as long as we know. And then at some point, the government came in and destroyed the money system. I read books like, Mises' theory of money and credit and human action and all that stuff. But at one point, I started reading up on MMT, and in particular, their argument that the state introduces, or historically always has introduced, a monetary unit by imposing a tax and demanding payment in that tax. So if you impose a tax, then you somehow need to give people the money that they need to pay the tax. As Warren Mosler said, for example, taxation creates unemployment. So if we accept that the entire money system is state-made to begin with, then a lot of things follow from that where I had to change my libertarian or my gold standard views significantly, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I'm just fascinated because, as we talk to people, there are so many today that are steeped in this gold standard mythology that haven't quite caught up to the fact that the U.S. has gone on and gone off of the gold standard throughout the years. Okay, hold on. Let me give you a full showing there. Hold on. What do we got?
This is David Graeber's Debt, the first 5,000 years. That, if there's any book that dispels that myth of the gold standard, then in my opinion, it would be this one.
That's a fantastic book. I couldn't see it at first, but now that I saw it. So when you look at the way that the gold standard folks go, They refuse to believe that this is sound money. But yet at the same time, though, if they don't believe it's sound money, then they can give me all their pieces of paper. It won't hurt them because it's worthless, right? It's just fake. They can give me all of their money, and we can be done with the conversation. They can go about gold, and I'll just keep all their paper.
Right. They have very unsatisfactory explanations as to why money has value. It's some mythology that people believe, and that's why these pieces of paper have money, and there's no other reason in their opinion.
So let me ask you a question. As someone who came from that gold set, what do you believe is the intrinsic value of gold? Is it that it's people like it for jewelry? It has value beyond the borders of the United States? What are some of the reasons why metallists typically will pull back to that gold standard? What do you think it is?
So in my opinion is, and David Graeber also writes about this in his book, that gold is the ultimate insurance policy. If everything goes to hell in a handbasket, if the government has to dissolve and bail, you can always take the gold with you. So that's, in my opinion, ultimately the reason why there will always be some sort of demand for gold. Just as people buy insurance, central banks and governments buy gold to be insured against catastrophic failure of the system.
And let's be fair, many libertarians believe the system is on the verge of collapse at any moment.
Right.
And so there's a lot of, I don't want to say paranoia, but I guess it is a little bit of paranoia there.
There are people like Peter Schiff to whom hyperinflation is around the corner any day now. He's been saying this for as long as he's been public on TV. And reality seems to prove him wrong again and again, but broken record doesn't change its tune. So yeah. But gold is also obviously, as you mentioned, used for jewelry and stuff like that. But that, in my opinion, is not necessarily the primary demand for it. Graeber also writes in his book about how gold throughout history has always been a very popular medium to use for temple sacrifice, because people, for superstitious reasons, used to believe it was the flesh from the gods or the tears from some sun god or this god or that, or some even believed it was pieces of the sun. So whatever it was, but then also it has its intrinsic characteristics, which is rarity and durability and uniformity and a lot of things about gold that you can't, we still can't manufacture it synthetically, as far as I'm aware, at least not at any reasonable cost. So that's why, in my opinion, gold will always have value, just not for the reason that the gold standard crowd thinks.
So it's a scarcity issue in the sense of this precious metal there's a finite amount of it. It's hard to get. You got to dig it out of the ground or whatever, et cetera. So because of that, and because it's not controlled by anyone, because it's a natural whatever, it's considered, it has a value in and of itself intrinsically.
Graeber actually writes in his book, one of the very remarkable characteristics of gold is that it can be stolen, if that makes sense. Because credit arrangements and agreements, I'm going to pay you, I'm going to pay him, there you always have you have individuals involved who trust one another. So that's a credit system. But if all of that fails, you can always take gold and take it with you and use it in payment, and nobody will ask you, where did that gold come from? That's why Graeber in Debt explains that there have been periods throughout human history where gold was more universally used than in others, in particular periods of significant warfare. And he cites as evidence, archaeological findings from. So he says the periods in which gold was more commonly used in exchange was the Axial Age, from I believe 700 BC to around 800 AD. And prior to that, we had a credit money system from something like 3500 through 700 BC. Then after 700 or 800 AD, all the way through the 1450, I believe, we had the medieval period during which credit arrangements were more prevalent again. And then we had the age of the great capitalist empires, which was once again a period of universal warfare, where gold became a significant medium of exchange. And that was from 1450 through 1971. And he basically says that that period ended when the US left the gold standard. And we now live, Graeber hypothesizes, in a new era where credit arrangements prevail over hard money type of exchange.
Very, very deep dive there. So let me ask you, so obviously there's a difference between a progressive viewpoint and a libertarian viewpoint. What are some of the things that you see as a differentiator that brings you to the libertarian perspective of the world? What are some of the values that you see as making you pull to libertarian?
To me, I mean, I'm a relentless defender of freedom of speech, and I also prefer not to have services delivered and things done by the government to the extent possible. I don't think the government is very good at the things they do end up doing. And so to me, where Warren Mosler says an MMT, to inject more net private savings, you can have more government spending to increase the deficit, but you can also cut taxes to increase the deficit. So to me, I would be more on the side of, why don't we try cutting taxes as much as possible, get rid of the income tax, get rid of corporate tax, things like that, and then see if that gives us enough net private saving to grow the economy. So I guess that's where I'm always I'm not so much into let's start a new government program to grow the economy. I'd like to see, let's try to reduce the amount of taxation and then allow people to have more money in their pockets first, and then see if private exchange, private markets, capital expansion, etc., can give us full employment and hopefully a vibrant middle class and things like that.
So, on one hand, as a MMT progressive, I would agree with you on the sense of the lack of need for heavy taxation, that quite frankly, we're overtaxed given the lack of services that we actually have. Where I'm going to take significant issue with you on is, I believe in my heart of hearts that we've seen our government when it's at max capacity, and that was during World War II. We saw our nation perform at a level never before seen in all of history, at this point anyway, based on government spending. When you look at, I hate to use Nazi Germany as a point in case, but when you look at the rise of Hitler, minus the insanity of Hitler, you see the power of state currency at play there as well. And you've seen it in various other forms throughout the course of history. When you look at the United States right now, from 1971 to present, it seems like they kept the population in the dark. And what they did was they stopped spending on the public purpose. And so what you've seen is a wealth gap that has gone like this through the roof. And you've seen the average man suffering and struggling at the bottom. Now, some would say that that is proof positive that government doesn't work. The other side of it, which is where I stand, is that we've watched powers that are very knowledgeable about the system do everything under the sun to make us believe that government can't work by starving it and making sure it's inadequate to do the job. And so while I certainly agree with you on bureaucracy, and I hate to see people suffer through the welfare state, because I am not a welfare person, I am purely a citizens benefit person. So there's a lot of commonality there, because I know when libertarians do talk about services, they don't like the idea of it being means test and all this other stuff. It's just like, give it all to everybody, like the UBI, which I don't stand for. I know a lot of libertarians have talked about a negative income tax or a UBI, and the idea is that everybody gets it. And from my vantage point as a progressive, I would much rather see everyone get services, everyone get access to health care, and forget cutting it off because of some fake budgetary number. If people have a problem, pay for it, period, full stop. Because what will happen is that already private sector will supply the demand. I mean, supply the supply to meet the demand. So as the government infuses money into the economy with programs to enable people to buy let's say healthcare. The private sector in and of itself can fill that gap as well. There's a whole host of democratic socialist viewpoints that are not too far off from a libertarian's when you consider proper funding models. When you think about it, like for example, hypothetically, you look at Medicare. One of the primary reasons why Medicare sucks in some ways is because they starve it. They try to nickel and dime it. And so the people that are really good at providing services and so on and so forth, they're only getting this small amount of money because of some fake scarcity that they're trying to play out there with the paper dollar. So in the sense that I understand where you come from, and I even understand why you don't like it, I believe the reason that it's failing is because of a fake scarcity in dollars. What are your thoughts?
Is the fake scarcity in dollars, or is the fake scarcity in medical services that have been monopolized, or at the very least oligopolized by government, corporate, and foundation lobbying? For example, the American Medical Association, in a very old journal, admitted publicly that the number of medical educational institutions is too high. The doctors and the healthcare providers who are not making enough money. We need to reduce the number of medical educational institutions. We need to make it more difficult to open hospitals. We need to make it more difficult to become a doctor. That's why you now have to, I don't know, spend how many years in college and go $250,000 debt to become a doctor. All these things are scarcity, in my opinion, created by government intervention that should be, first of all, we should get rid of that, in my opinion, before we expand the deficit, or before we use the power of the state to provide more services in a totally overly expensive field that wouldn't have to be this expensive if we didn't have all these regulations and interventions.
Well, ironically, it's funny you should say that.
So somebody says here, I disagree. We need more medical facilities. I said exactly that. So yes. What do you disagree with?
I think what you're hearing is this, and this is the big chasm when you have these battles, right? So when you look at the scarcity, to what you're saying, the reason they put these boundaries in place, ironically, just like a lot of automatic stabilizers, is to create economic activity. And so they create these inefficient pieces of economic activity instead of being bold and brave and creating new things and expanding entrepreneurship to bring about a transition to the next evolution. The false scarcity, and exactly what you said, there is a crosshair, a sweet spot, if you will, between regulation that saves lives and regulation that's just there simply to create economic activity and false scarcity. And so I agree with you to that extent, yes. So I will tell you, for people that follow us, and for myself as well, I believe that healthcare is a right. I believe there's certain rights. And when I say a right, I mean this is something that our government, with its sovereign currency, could provide. It's not like we would be taking away a doctor's right to do whatever. It would be more along the lines of the fees that go to that would be paid by our government versus making someone go bankrupt because they get cancer. And so in my mind, the idea of holding someone's life in their hands over a scarcity of pieces of paper is a crime against humanity, because it's not the piece of paper that we care about. It's the resource, which is the doctor's skills or the hospital's bed or the medicine that they supply. And so these are things that we could split the divide, limit some regulation, provide access to different levels of doctors so we could expand the supply to meet the demand as we service every human being on the planet, as opposed to just those who have enough pieces of paper.
Yeah, we have to increase the supply, I agree, but that doesn't involve necessarily, first and foremost, in my opinion, that involves cutting burdensome regulations that have been designed to create healthcare monopolies.
Now, I don't disagree with some of that, because that's exactly what they do. They create barriers to entry. They do an awful lot of things. I mean, you watch, like, for example, I know some people are going to hate me for bringing this up, but when you look at agriculture, for example, they've made it so that small butchers, for example, or small meat producers that want to do it ethically, et cetera. They can't gain access to the market because the cost of entry has been made so high because of regulation that it freezes them out and it puts all of it to the big heavy hitters. And so all the small players are squeezed out of the market. And you see that all over the country with these monopolies rolling through and literally eliminating any competition whatsoever.
Yeah, there was. I read this recently. I got to look up the exact numbers, but there were more medical educational institutions in the US, something like several decades ago versus now. I think like 100 years ago, there was more medical educational institutions in the US than there are now. That the opposite should be the case.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, I could say, I want to just state this for the record, and this may be another area where we differ from, but going back to 71, when we were removed from, you know, the Bretton Woods Accord and the convertibility to gold ended, what also happened was the Milton Friedman era and the Chicago school, which came through. And what they did was they made everyone panic about this non-existent inflation. And so what they did by jumping on this OPEC scare that occurred, they created something so intrinsic, so deeply held now that we can't even make good progressives stop worrying about inflation. When you look at Japan, who's got 250% debt to GDP, sitting there barely able to crack 2% inflation. It's ridiculous. So we know that the quantity theory of money is no longer really applicable in this environment. So when you get rid of, what's that?
Never was.
Well, that's my point. He used faulty stuff nonstop. It was bogus from Jump Street. But the point is that we believed it for so long. It's become intrinsic to the way we view everything. And they used that from 1971 to present. So you look at what's happened. They've starved the public space. And they've allowed it to go to vultures and predators instead of allowing it to go to the people. And so what you've got is a huge chasm that has bred cynicism and hatred and death as a direct result of that entire split. That could have been the opening of a great new tomorrow. So much incredible things could have happened right then and there, but we never embraced it. We allowed, well, to be fair, we were lied to and have been lied to for forever. And that's part of what fascinates me about you is your ability to have broken from that lie and seen through it. Let's go back to that for a minute and talk about how you were able to break free. You said something didn't quite smell right. Talk to me about what the things were that you found that made you realize that what you had been thinking just wasn't so.
One was, you know, government programs like QE and predictions from Austrians that this is going to create hyperinflation, and the opposite seems to have happened, hyperdeflation or something along those lines. That was probably the biggest one I can think of at the top of my head right now. You know, like Japan being, like, as you just said, 250% or more of their GDP is government debt, yet they have the lowest interest rate of all, probably of all industrialized countries. That shouldn't be the case if, you know, if there was such a thing as bond vigilantes who can sell the bonds and pressure the government into cutting spending and stuff like that. Just certain things in that I observed in reality that didn't match up with the theory that I'd been working with from based on Austrian economics, gold standard, etc. type of thinking.
So as we go forward, one of the other things that was exciting was the fact that, you know, we had talked a little bit offline, joked around about the difference between Bitcoin and a sovereign currency, and the fact that one is an investment and the other one is a currency, as it were. What are some of the differences in your mind as somebody who, well, before we go there, why don't you tell us about your background in cryptocurrency?
Yeah, just before we go there, one more thing I wanted to mention in regards to the Friedmanite thinking that started in the 70s. I don't know if you've read Randy Ray's book, why Minsky matters?
Yes, sir. Got it right here. Yep.
Great. Yeah, because in there, I mean, that blew my mind, where one sentence somewhere in the book, I got to look it up again. Minsky basically said that the reason why people suddenly have so much stocks in their 401ks, etc., why we rely so much on common stock financing, was the monetarist falsehood that inflation was just around the corner and we had to raise interest rates in order to fight inflation. In reality, it seems as though we now know that interest rates really have almost nothing to do with inflation. All they basically did was increase the subsidy paid out to banks and people who are holding on to government bonds, so people who can afford to have cash on hand to invest in those securities. So to me, the federal funds rate is in last resort really just a subsidy to rich people.
Amen.
More than anything.
Yes. It's just a basic income for the rich. Exactly. That's exactly what it is. And we could stop selling bonds tomorrow. I mean, there are some. Joe Firestone has got this piece of legislation that he's trying to push. It's actually a verbiage he's calling OCF, which is overt congressional funding. And basically what it does is it gets rid of all the myths about the debt. And it says we will have the Fed automatically put money into the Treasury's account to spend, period. And it basically wipes out any of the nonsense about, whether or not we can afford it, whether we need to be in debt, et cetera. And if they say no to it, then they're full of shit, really is what it comes down to.
Yeah, the only real honest reason for the Fed to set any type of interest rate would be, do we want to have a state-subsidized retirement system for everyone? And, hopefully for everyone. But, ultimately, it really only benefits people who have a lot of money, because the rates are so low now, especially. It really only provides a relevant basic income for people who have a lot of money to put in those types of securities.
Okay, so let's go ahead and jump, because as much as I want to talk about MMT, we talk about it an awful lot around here. I want to talk about crypto because it's, I try and explain to people, let me lead in with this. I try and explain to people, look, I'm not for or against crypto. It has great uses. The technology of blockchain has tremendous opportunity to revolutionize voting, to do a whole host of things. I mean, a ton of things that go beyond just even a currency. So there's beautiful things underlying the technology. However, the various Bitcoin, Litecoin, Ripple, you name it, all these different currencies that are out there, they're not a state currency, and they have a very different purpose, and they're very volatile in terms of they would not make for a good currency because of that volatility. Talk to us a little bit about why you got into crypto and your history with it and the differences between state money and Bitcoin, et cetera.
Yeah. So I started getting into crypto in 2011. I got to it through, I'd say, the understanding of two different concepts. One was the gold standard, or the belief that there's a gold money system. Ironically, that was part of how I got into it. But also BitTorrent and just generally the concept of decentralization. So to me, when I first came across Bitcoin, I just thought, well, this is basically BitTorrent for money, and it's kind of like a digital gold. And so that's how I got into it. This was in 2011. I started buying Bitcoins and mining Bitcoins for a little while. And I started some businesses around it. I went to a whole bunch of conferences over the years. So I've been around in crypto for quite a long time. And over the years, my views on it as a solution to, much like you're saying right now, my views about crypto as a solution to our problems in the world have been somewhat moderated over time. I don't think that crypto is the solution to our problems, because a lot of people think, oh, crypto is going to get rid of central banks, etc., and central banks are the root of all evil, and we just got to get rid of those, and then everything will be fine. Well, I mean, I don't want to be strawmanning people now, but a lot of people really think that crypto will save us from the clutches of the central banks. I think that maybe one day it may well happen. We haven't had a crypto country yet, and as you said, most countries are basically based on a state money system. So at the moment, cryptocurrency is something that definitely can be used as an investment tool, as a way to secure your savings or a certain portion of it. And investing in crypto, personally, I've obviously done pretty well because I've been there for a long time. But and I've never been into trading much. I've always been a buy and hold investor. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend that people try to get rich quick using crypto. Obviously, like you said, the difference between crypto is that between crypto and state money is that crypto is very volatile. Plus, you can't use crypto to pay your taxes. So as long as there's taxation, there will always be state money. You can't, I mean, if you understand MMT, you will understand that. But a lot of people who are in crypto don't understand MMT. I've actually written an article where I've explained cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Litecoin in many ways fundamentally are based on the principles of MMT. Because in a state money system, a government imposes a tax, and thus the money becomes useful and valuable, and you needed to pay your taxes. That's compulsory. In the crypto world, the miners impose a fee, if you will. You have to pay your fee in Bitcoins to be able to get access to the Bitcoin blockchain. So as long as people want to have access to the Bitcoin blockchain, they need some Bitcoins. And from there, in my opinion at least, we get why Bitcoin is valuable, because there's always going to be someone who's going to need it to access the blockchain. So as long as we believe that there's value in having access to the Bitcoin blockchain, there's going to be value in cryptocurrencies.
Very cool. So ultimately, I had a discussion this afternoon with a really, really sharp guy from Cornell Law, Robert Hockett. And we talked at length about shadow banking. And we talked about the great financial crisis, the global financial crisis that kind of kickstarted a lot of things, that made people start really, really looking at crypto as a way out to make sure that they could survive the next crash and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of, I almost lost everything in this crash. And so you think about it, there's real good reason to be scared. But he said he is concerned about crypto, the way these are being the next CDO, synthetic CDO kind of bubble coming through because it's unregulated. This is another opportunity for that same scenario to play out only differently. What are your thoughts there? Because you see the craze. People are mortgaging their homes. People are going crazy trying to get in on this thing. And it's like, oh, God, please don't do that. And you even told me, don't do anything crazy, man. Maybe a little bit of a hedge here, but don't go crazy. Talk about that.
Yeah. So I still have to watch that interview. But I don't know that there's evidence that this trend is pervasive yet. That a lot of cryptos are being bought on credit. But if I see that, then I would start to get very worried because, credit financed booms are generally, oftentimes turn into bubbles, and bubbles crash because people have, private debt that they can't pay, et cetera, et cetera. It's true that there is now a trend is starting now where there's funds coming out who are leveraged, So far, I've only seen relatively benign leverage, like 2 times or something like that. Back in the 2007 crisis, I think there was, if you add it all up, absolutely ridiculous leverage multipliers, something like 50 or more, even if you count derivatives, CDOs, etc. So if that is, I don't know that we're there yet in Bitcoin. So if there is such a trend, we'll see a bubble, but I see that down the road, not right now, because most mostly the way people get into crypto, in my experience, still at least over the past 9 years or so, has been people buying a little bit here and there. And then, yes, of course, you read the big news stories. Oh, somebody mortgaged their home. Those are individual cases. It'll be interesting to see how pervasive that trend is.
Sure. So what would a person such as yourself, who has spent a lot of time investigating, pursuing this, what would be some of your, and mind you, I know that you're not a financial advisor, et cetera, but none of us are here. We're just concerned citizens sharing information with one another. There's your disclaimer. So what would be some of your advice to people that are looking at crypto and that might be interested in getting involved in it?
I would say, if you're interested in crypto, if I were to get in today, what I would do is I would look at the top 5 market cap coins and allocate a certain amount of money that I'm willing to put on a blackjack table, a certain amount of money that I'm okay losing, and then split it up based on the market cap percentages that are currently, in the crypto market. I wouldn't obviously I wouldn't put your 401k or mortgage your house, anything. I wouldn't do anything like that. That's in my opinion, that's crazy to do something like that. And yeah, you're right. I don't do investment advice, but I can tell you, if we see a big boom or another big craze like 2007, 2008, who's to say that crypto will be the hedge against the coming crash? Because if crypto becomes more and more credit financed in some sort of boom, then we may see a crash in crypto just as much as in, crazy internet stocks or whatever, what have you. It could easily be the next crash. So if you want to protect yourself against a crash, at least what I do, if I want to be protected no matter what, I put the majority of my savings in very safe assets. I apply Harry Brown's permanent portfolio strategy. Very simple: 25% bonds, 25% gold, 25% stocks, 25% cash. And this way, I'm always prepared, no matter what happens. We have an economic boom. Great. My stocks have gone up. My bonds have done okay. My gold has done okay. My cash has earned some interest. We have a depression or a giant crash. My bonds will skyrocket. My government bonds will skyrocket. We have some kind of giant war or zombie apocalypse disaster. My gold will do great. And at any time, I always have cash to have access to. That's what I do. I can't give advice, obviously, but that's what I do.
No, that's great. I mean, we very often don't talk that way because I live in the macro world. And so the vast majority of my concerns are getting progressives mobilized to do things that serve what they're fighting for, right? Their value system, et cetera, and trying to give them the tools to fight that battle. But this is an opportunity for folks because, I feel bad for them, right? I mean, I feel bad for a lot of people. They're putting their hopes and dreams in cryptocurrency as if it is the second coming of the Messiah. And I'm not even joking. I have lost more friends just trying to explain, guys, not only will crypto never give you, I mean, I know some of these things aren't things you're going to want, but I just put them out there. Cryptocurrency is never going to give you student loan eradication. Cryptocurrency is never going to give you national health care service. Cryptocurrency is not going to give you a nationalized green energy, rehab. It's not going to give you the full-blown infrastructure. It's an investment, and it's something that you can partake in, and it's something that you can make a lot of money at, or it's something you can lose money at. But it's not the solution for these programs that progressives claim to want and fight for, like a New Deal or a second Bill of Rights. And when you talk about that to people, I explain to them, as a former libertarian, et cetera, that this is kind of like, once again, dare I say, neoliberalism in its own sense, because you're going to a private solution, seeking private answers to answer the societal question. And for a progressive, we are statists. I am statist. I'm definitely a statist, and I wear it proudly. But, the idea that, we as a collective have things that we as a collective should do. And then I believe that there are many things that we should not do as a collective. I believe in most of the libertarian freedoms a lot of them I still hold near and dear to myself. I just am a completely opposite on the state side when it comes to the New Deal and programs. I guess that's why I'm a progressive and not a Democrat per se. But in your case, though, I think that you've written some really good stuff. I mean, your article, just so you know, I loved your article. It was fantastic. And I was jaw dropped at a guy who is unabashedly libertarian, writing for being libertarian, and sitting there and wrote such a phenomenal piece. Can you talk a little bit about that article for a minute?
Yeah, that article, it's on beinglibertarian.com. It's called Modern Monetary Theory. I just laid out what I learned after a couple of months of watching YouTube videos, reading books from Randy Ray, Minsky, and just sort of somehow explained why I was unsatisfied with Austrian economics to an extent, and some of the just some of the facts that I learned about the monetary system and how it actually works. Basically, looking at the monetary system like an engineer who wants to build an airplane or something. An engineer who wants to build an airplane has to understand how an airplane works. So somebody who wants to understand the economy has to understand the mechanics of the system. So I just basically laid out what I understood and sort of the falsehoods that were dispelled over the period of my study, and I got a lot of at least interested feedback from people in the libertarian community as well. I haven't been attacked much for it or anything like that, because I didn't much like you, the basics of my libertarian philosophy haven't really been shaken, I guess, but I just had a better understanding of the existing monetary system.
So for me, it changed a little bit, obviously.
Yeah.
Hey, can you turn that volume down a little bit?
Sure.
So for me, what I found was that, I realized that many of the beliefs that I had as a libertarian were about me getting mine. Like I really did. It was out of fear, largely, because I felt like if I didn't go after mine, I wouldn't get mine and someone else would get mine. And that's a very simplified version. That's not exactly as it is, but I'm just trying to say that there was a fear-based system there that pushed me to not want to help everyone, but to go for my own. And as I realized, much of the beliefs that I was operating under were under a false scarcity, a major shift happened because I really wanted everybody to benefit from this. And that's what's driven me 24/7 is to try to get people to have, I lost my job after 17 years and was destitute. And there was nothing there. No amount of self-determination, no amount of Ayn Rand cheering me on was going to save me. And quite frankly, my teeth started rotting out of my mouth. I started having major health problems. My grass was 6 feet tall. My house was going to get repossessed. I had nowhere to go. And it really opened my eyes, and no offense, to how absolutely incompatible my beliefs were with being in a society that I felt could flourish. I didn't see libertarianism as a rational outcome of that any longer. It really opened my eyes that if a guy with that much education and practical experience and a resume big enough to choke a donkey, and I'd saved money and I'd taken care of myself, here I was incapable of surviving. And at that moment in time, I realized that I couldn't do this anymore in good conscience. And it really did kickstart the changes in my life. That to me is what really solidified the shift away from that world and made me I'm a true democratic socialist through and through based on MMT now. I just wanted to throw that out there as like a key differentiator of what changed my mind. What took me out of that world entirely was living the experience of having taken care of myself, thinking I took care of myself, and then experiences beyond my control. And then I started boiling it down deeper and deeper and saying, well, shit, if that can happen to a guy that's carrying like 5 certifications, 2 master's degrees, an undergrad of this, of that, of the other, a friggin' massive resume with system engineering background, Cisco engineering, you name it, all this stuff, and I couldn't find work, how much worse was it for other people that didn't have a family to support them, didn't have a government to help them, didn't have anything to help them? And then you go to the church and you get the churches out there looking down their nose because maybe you didn't say the right Jesus name or something to that effect. And you've got all these different groups out there. And that's when I realized that the government does owe you a job. The government does owe you a living. If it's going to be the controller of the currency, then it owes you certain life-saving things, because there's no more homesteading. You can't just go plop a house down in the random middle of the woods and start from scratch and start making potatoes and, hunting deer. I mean, they've got it. The world is condensed now. So now you're kind of a part of the matrix, if you will. In order to survive, there's got to be some give there. And that's when I made my shift. That's the way I boiled it down anyway. I mean, it became a moral imperative to me to change that. That's an exchange moment there. Whatever you think, because I know that you feel differently. I'm just curious where you ended up with that.
Because most libertarians agree that the system is messed up. And so, the fact that you're experiencing a bunch of problems in a messed up system, to me, doesn't necessarily challenge that belief. There's a lot of unemployment. Libertarians will say it's because of misallocation of resources. I admit that in part it's because of a lack of net private saving, which is because the deficit might be too small, or we are just too worried about deficits all the time. And to me personally, the solution would be, why don't we try massive tax cuts to solve that problem? I could be wrong in that, but I would have to see the evidence. And to me, I would prefer to go down that route before embarking on new government programs. But no question, either approach has to be taken if these problems are to be solved.
Understood. All right. So listen, I did not, just so we're all on the same page, you're a friend of mine. We don't agree on a lot of things on that realm.
I disagree with myself half the time. So
exactly. But I want to be clear, though. When I spoke to you, I want to make sure everybody understands. One of the most friendly conversations I've ever had, our first conversation, and right off the bat, you were like willing to help me in anything at all. You just have a fundamental difference with me about the role of government in this system here. And I will tell you, I disagree strongly there. But that doesn't change the fact that I think you're a good guy. And I didn't bring you on here to have any kind of a difference per se in that respect, because quite frankly, I want everybody to understand the first level of getting us to a new tomorrow, right, wrong, or indifferent, is getting rid of the myths and legends that block us from being able to understand how the system works. Wherever you come, Mosler will tell you that MMT has a slight, it can work for libertarians, it can work for Republicans, it can work for whoever. But as I've grown to believe, when you understand the federal job guarantee, which is an underpinning to make an efficient economy, given the fact that the dollar is in essence a tax credit meant to make you unemployed, when you understand that, you do come down on the idea that the government owes you a job if it's going to force you to have a tax.
If the government intervention created unemployment, any libertarian would even agree, then the government has to solve the problem. It can't be solved through any other means. That's right.
So, well, anyway, listen, with that, we're at the end here. I want to thank you so much for coming on here. This is very exciting to me. I'm going to try and have other people from other walks of life join me on this show, because I want to break down the partisanship in terms of the monetary system. I would rather fight you head on with a true understanding of the monetary system based on your belief of what works and what doesn't work than have to fight through a million lies and myths about Austrian economics.
I want to say to that point, I just want to say that there are very powerful people who benefit from you and me hating each other, and benefit from me and other Democrats or whatever hating each other. That's why you see so much animosity, so much hatred, so much division created by the mainstream media, in my opinion. So I want us to have debates and exchange facts and disagree like adults, and not throw ad hominems and poorly constructed non-arguments at each other.
Right. And I will tell you, it's interesting because while I would fight you down to the nub over social programs, but I don't like social. And let me say it differently. I like citizens benefits, right? Like, period, where everybody from the richest guy to the poorest guy gets benefits, period. Like, you walk in the door and you got them, right? That, to me, free college, whatever, I don't care. The point I'm making is that while we would disagree, we would be disagreeing with a full understanding of how the monetary system works. We wouldn't have to start peeling back lies after lie after lie. And that, to me, is a big start. I can have a conversation with people I can't stand. As long as we're dealing in true facts, there's a lot that can be found out. We can change each other's mind when we're dealing in facts and empirical evidence, as opposed to mythology and crap, tales from the fire pit. And let me just end on this note. There is nothing worse than sitting in a room with people that you get the feeling that their idea of what government spending is or isn't is something they learned from some like bar stool chat with some dude, who just hates the world. I want to have somebody that can, and look, you just sat there and you quoted from Ray, Minsky, Mosler, Graeber. So you've done your homework. I mean, you understand the system. You fundamentally disagree with me on the politics of it all and the program side and the approach to solving these real world problems. That's an area that, while we'll disagree, I can disagree with you respectfully, and we can have a conversation about how to fix that in the future. What is impossible to bridge is when you're not dealing with a common set of facts. And so from that standpoint, I want to thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. My pleasure.
All right. Have a great night, Ni Ma. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us at Real Progressives. We'll be back soon.